The large glass doors of New York Children's Hospital slid open as Thomas Harrison, a man known for both his wealth and philanthropy, stepped inside. He had walked these corridors many times, his presence no longer causing a stir among the nurses and staff. Today, he was here to finalize the donation for the new pediatric oncology wing, a project close to his heart. However, despite the familiar surroundings, something felt different today, an unsettling tension gnawing at the back of his mind. As he passed by colorful murals and the cheerful chatter of young patients, Thomas couldn't help but think back to his own childhood. The memories were fragmented, most of them blurry, but one thing stood out: the heavy weight of responsibility he had carried from a young age. His family's wealth had been built on generations of hard work and sacrifice, and with that came expectations. Perhaps that was why he felt drawn to these children, their innocence untouched by the burdens that had always loomed over him. A gentle tug at his sleeve brought him back to the present. Looking down, he saw a small girl, no older than 6, standing beside him. Her face was pale, framed by a halo of light brown curls. She wore a hospital gown far too large for her tiny frame, but her eyes, those bright, curious eyes, locked onto his with an intensity that startled him. "Excuse me, mister," the girl said, her voice soft but confident. "My daddy has a ring just like yours." Thomas froze. His hand instinctively went to the silver ring on his finger, an heirloom passed down from his grandfather. It was an intricately carved piece, unique, as far as he knew. The idea that someone else had a matching ring seemed impossible. He crouched down to her level, curiosity bubbling up inside him. "Your daddy, you say? Where is he?" Thomas asked, trying to keep his tone light, though the child's words had set his heart racing. The girl pointed down the hallway, where a group of parents and visitors waited near the elevators. "He's coming back soon. He's just getting something for me to eat." Thomas smiled at her, though his mind raced. A ring like mine? That was absurd. His family's ring was a symbol of their legacy, a sign of their bloodline. The idea that someone else, a stranger, could have the same ring left him unsettled. He looked at the girl again, but before he could ask more questions, a nurse approached and gently led her away toward a playroom. "Come on, Emma. Time to let the nice man go about his day," the nurse said kindly. "Emma," the girl, waved at Thomas before disappearing into the playroom, leaving him standing alone in the middle of the corridor, his thoughts in turmoil. The busy hum of the hospital faded into the background as Thomas stood there, staring at the silver band on his finger. For years, it had been a simple reminder of family, of the Harisian bloodline. But now, that single remark from a child stirred something in him, something long buried. He had never questioned the ring's significance before today. Why now? As he moved toward the elevator, intending to leave, he couldn't shake the conversation from his mind. What if this was more than a coincidence? What if there was something deeper, something tied to the past he had long thought buried? The thought simmered, refusing to dissipate. Thomas glanced back down the hallway, where the playroom door had closed behind the little girl. He felt a pull, an inexplicable urge to stay, to learn more. Thomas sat at his desk later that night, the soft glow of a lamp casting shadows across the room. His office was a study in contrasts, modern furniture mixed with antique artifacts, a reflection of his life, rooted in family tradition yet moving relentlessly forward. But his mind wasn't on the work scattered in front of him. He was consumed by a singular thought, the little girl's words in the hospital. "My daddy has a ring just like yours." It was absurd. The Harrison family ring had been passed down for generations, its history well documented. Thomas had worn it since his father's death, and before that, his father had worn it for as long as he could remember. No one outside of their bloodline should have had that ring. Yet, Emma's innocent remark gnawed at him. Determined to learn more, Thomas had made a discreet call to the hospital earlier in the evening. He had asked for information about Emma and her father, under the guise of wanting to offer assistance to the family. The receptionist had been hesitant at first, bound by protocol, but with a bit of persistence and charm, Thomas learned the name of Emma's father, Samuel Carter. The name meant nothing to him. Carter was an ordinary surname, one that could belong to anyone, but that didn't calm the unease roiling in his gut. Something felt off, as if this connection, however thin, was tied to something bigger, something he couldn't yet see. Unable to let it go, Thomas sat back and stared at the ceiling. He needed more than just a name. He needed to know who Samuel Carter was. He opened his laptop and quickly typed in the name, sifting through various results. Most were irrelevant. Samuel Carter was a common enough name. But then, after a few more minutes of searching, he found something that caught his attention. A local carpenter. Samuel Carter, the father of Emma Carter, lived modestly on the outskirts of the city. The few social media mentions were unremarkable, photos of handmade furniture and occasional family snapshots. Yet, despite the ordinary life portrayed, there was something that drew Thomas in. He had seen the man briefly at the hospital, standing far off near the elevators, unaware of the weight of his daughter's words. He remembered his face now. There had been something familiar about it, though he couldn't place why. Thomas clicked through Samuel's sparse online presence, scrutinizing every detail. The man seemed honest, hardworking, and, judging by the photos of his daughter, a devoted father. But that didn't explain the ring. It didn't explain the pull Thomas felt toward this stranger, this man who apparently had no connection to the Harrison family. It was irrational to fixate on this. After all, it was just a ring, a trinket from the past. But Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more, something personal. He leaned forward, the tension in his shoulders building. He needed to know more. The following morning, Thomas arrived at the small neighborhood where Samuel Carter lived. The houses were modest, with small front yards and fences that had seen better days. It was a far cry from the world Thomas inhabited, a world of luxury penthouses and high-rise offices. Yet, as he stepped out of his car, a strange sense of familiarity washed over him. This wasn't the kind of place he'd ever been to before, but it felt significant, like he had been drawn here for a reason. He approached the small house that matched the address he had found online. The door was slightly ajar, and from inside, he could hear the sound of a saw whirring, followed by the sharp clatter of wood being placed on a workbench. Thomas hesitated for a moment. What was he doing here? He had no logical reason to confront Samuel Carter, and yet, he found himself knocking on the door. The noise inside stopped abruptly, and after a moment, the door swung open. Samuel stood in the doorway, a look of mild confusion on his face. He was younger than Thomas had initially thought, his features weathered by years of hard work, but not yet old. His hands were covered in sawdust, and he wiped them on a rag as he sized up Thomas, clearly unsure why a stranger in an expensive suit had shown up at his front door. "Can I help you?" Samuel asked, his tone polite but cautious. Thomas cleared his throat, suddenly unsure how to begin. He wasn't here to cause trouble. He just needed answers. "I'm sorry for the intrusion," he started, his voice more formal than he intended. "My name is Thomas Harrison. We met briefly at the hospital. Your daughter mentioned something yesterday, about a ring." Samuel's eyes narrowed slightly, and his hand instinctively brushed the ring on his own finger. The same ring. There it was. The identical silver band, worn and aged, a mirror image of the one Thomas had worn his whole life. A heavy silence fell between them as the two men stared at each other, both suddenly aware of the strange, invisible thread connecting them. Samuel glanced down at his own ring, confusion clouding his expression. "I don't understand," he said slowly, his voice tinged with unease. "It's just a ring. I've had it for as long as I can remember. It was passed down in my family." Thomas swallowed hard, the realization hitting him with the force of a train. "Passed down in your family," he repeated, his mind racing. Could it be? Could they somehow be related? The possibility seemed absurd, yet the evidence was right in front of him, on both of their hands. Samuel seemed to sense the weight of Thomas's thoughts. "Why does this matter to you?" he asked, his voice firmer now. "Why are you here?" Thomas looked Samuel in the eye, struggling to find the right words. "Because," he said finally, "I think we might have more in common than just a ring." The conversation with Samuel left Thomas rattled, a weight settling in his chest that he couldn't shake. As he drove back from the small house on the outskirts of the city, his thoughts raced. The identical rings weren't a coincidence, and now he knew it. Samuel had no idea how connected they might be, but Thomas couldn't ignore the signs. He needed answers, real answers, and there was only one place to find them. He pulled into his driveway with a sense of urgency, the gravel crunching beneath his tires as the car rolled to a stop. His home, usually a place of comfort and calm, now felt heavy with the secrets it harbored. He hurried inside, heading straight to his father's old study. The room had been left nearly untouched since his father's death. Dust gathered on the leather-bound books and antique trinkets, and the air smelled faintly of old paper. Thomas approached the large oak desk that had once belonged to his father, his heart pounding in his chest. He knelt down and pulled open one of the heavy drawers, his fingers brushing over the edges of old documents and letters. He knew what he was looking for, though he hadn't thought about it in years. As a child, he had once stumbled across a letter, a vague mention of a brother, an idea that had seemed too fantastical to take seriously at the time. But now, with the puzzle pieces falling into place, he knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. After a few minutes of searching, Thomas found what he was looking for. His hand trembled as he pulled out a faded envelope, the edges worn from age. His mother's handwriting was scrawled across the front. He remembered the story now, how she had mentioned it in passing once, only to quickly change the subject, but it had stuck with him, a lingering question in the back of his mind that he had never been brave enough to ask. He opened the envelope carefully, his breath catching in his throat as he unfolded the brittle paper. The letter was addressed to his mother, written by his father shortly after Thomas had been born. "Dearest Eleanor," it began, "I write this letter not out of joy, but out of necessity. You know I am not a man who believes in keeping secrets, but there are some truths too painful to speak aloud. You must understand that what I did to protect us all. The boy, our second son, he was taken. I have failed to find him, but I believe he lives. I will continue searching. Know that this was not by choice, but by cruel fate. If I am unable to find him before my time runs out, I leave this burden to you, to tell Thomas when the time is right." Thomas stared at the words, his mind spinning. A second son? His chest tightened as the reality of what he was reading sank in. His father had known. He had known all along that Thomas wasn't an only child. He had a brother. Samuel? It was the only explanation that made sense. The matching rings, the timing, the eerie familiarity he had felt upon meeting him. It all pointed to the same conclusion. But how could this be? Why had they been separated? Thomas folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope, his mind racing. He needed to know more, and there was only one person who could give him answers now, his mother. The next morning, Thomas found himself at his mother's house, the sun just beginning to rise over the horizon. Eleanor Harrison was a regal woman, her years marked by grace and composure, but even she couldn't hide the surprise in her eyes when she opened the door and found her son standing there unannounced. "Thomas," she greeted him, her voice warm but curious. "It's early. What brings you here?" Thomas stepped inside without a word, his heart pounding. He wasn't sure how to begin, but he knew there was no time for small talk. He handed her the letter, watching as the recognition flickered across her face. Eleanor's eyes softened with a mix of sadness and something else. Regret, perhaps. She sank into the nearest chair, the letter trembling in her hands. "You found it," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Thomas sat across from her, his gaze unwavering. "I need to know the truth, Mom. Who is he? What happened?" Eleanor took a deep breath, her eyes glistening as she looked up at her son. "It was a long time ago, Thomas. You and Samuel were born on the same day, in the same hospital. You were twins, identical, except for the ring your father gave you both, a tradition in his family. We were so happy that day. But everything changed when a fire broke out in the hospital nursery." Thomas listened, frozen by the words spilling from his mother's lips. He had no idea that the day of his birth had been marred by tragedy. "The fire was devastating," she continued, her voice shaking. "The nurses and doctors tried to save as many babies as they could, but in the chaos, Samuel was lost. We were told he had died in the fire. Your father, though, he never believed it. He spent years searching, convinced that Samuel had somehow survived. He never gave up, but eventually, the trail went cold. Thomas felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. All these years, he had lived his life never knowing that somewhere out there, his twin brother had been living a completely different life. A life without the wealth, without the privilege, without the Harrison name. "Samuel's alive," Thomas said, his voice barely a whisper. "I met him. He's been here this whole time, living as someone else." Eleanor looked at him, her eyes widening with disbelief. "You found him?" Thomas nodded. "His name is Samuel Carter now. He has a daughter, and he's wearing the same ring." Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes brimming with tears. "Oh, Thomas, I never thought we would find him." Neither had Thomas. But now that he had, he wasn't sure what to do next. All he knew was that the truth had finally come to light, and nothing would ever be the same again. The rain tapped lightly against the window of the cafe where Thomas sat, his coffee untouched. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions: fear, anticipation, guilt, each one battling for control as he stared out at the gray sky. The weight of the previous day's revelations still pressed heavily on his chest. He had a brother, and not just any brother, but Samuel Carter, the man whose life had unknowingly paralleled his own for decades, hidden just out of sight. Thomas had arranged to meet Samuel here, in this quiet cafe outside the city, unsure of what to expect. How do you approach a man who has no idea he's your twin brother? How do you explain the stolen years, the different paths their lives had taken? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the door opening, followed by heavy footsteps on the wooden floor. Thomas turned, and there he was, Samuel. He had the same strong jawline, the same sharp blue eyes. It was uncanny. For a brief moment, Thomas felt like he was staring into a mirror, only the reflection wasn't quite the same. Samuel's clothes were simpler, his face more worn from years of hard labor. But the resemblance was undeniable. Samuel's eyes flickered with confusion and a hint of recognition as he approached the table. He paused for a second, his gaze locking onto Thomas, before pulling out a chair and sitting down. "You wanted to talk," Samuel said, his voice steady but cautious. There was an air of skepticism about him, as if he wasn't sure why he'd been called here. "Something about the ring?" Thomas nodded, but words failed him for a moment. Now that they were face to face, the enormity of the situation hit him all over again. How do you tell someone their entire life has been a lie? "Thank you for coming," Thomas began, his voice thick with emotion. "This is complicated, more complicated than I could have imagined." He took a deep breath, his hands shaking slightly as he tried to collect his thoughts. Samuel watched him closely, his brow furrowing. "What's this about? You've been vague, and I don't have time for games." "No games," Thomas said quickly. I don't know how to say this, so I'm just going to tell you straight." He hesitated for a second, looking Samuel directly in the eye. "You're my brother. We're twins." The words hung in the air, heavy and surreal. Samuel blinked, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out at first. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he managed to say, "What the hell are you talking about?" Thomas leaned forward, his heart pounding. "It sounds insane, I know, but it's the truth. You and I were born on the same day, in the same hospital. There was a fire. You were taken. Our parents thought you had died, but you didn't. You were adopted, and I was raised never knowing I had a brother." Samuel stared at him, his face hardening. "This is some kind of joke, right? Who put you up to this?" "No joke, Samuel. I have proof. A letter from my father, our father. He spent years looking for you. I found out about you just recently, but when I did, I couldn't stay quiet." Samuel stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "This is insane. I don't know what you think you know, but I'm not your brother." His voice was shaking, filled with anger and frustration. Thomas stood as well, desperate to stop him from leaving. "Please, Samuel, just listen. I know this is a shock, but everything adds up. The ring, the dates, everything. Just give me a chance to explain." Samuel turned away, running a hand through his hair, visibly struggling to process what Thomas had just told him. "I grew up in foster homes, bouncing from one place to another. My parents never told me anything about being adopted, and now you're telling me I'm part of some rich family? That I've had a brother all along? You expect me to just accept that? Thomas swallowed hard. I don't expect you to accept it right away, but I'm telling you the truth. I've spent the last few days piecing everything together. We were separated because of the fire. Our father tried to find you, but he never could. Samuel, I'm sorry. I'm sorry you had to grow up without knowing, but you're not alone anymore. Samuel was silent for a long time, his back turned to Thomas. The rain outside had intensified, drumming against the windows, matching the tension inside the cafe. Finally, Samuel turned back around, his face a mixture of anger, confusion, and something else. Maybe hope, buried deep beneath the surface. And what am I supposed to do with this information? Samuel asked, his voice quieter now, almost broken. What do you want from me, Thomas? I don't want anything, Thomas said softly. I just want to know you. We've spent our whole lives apart, and I don't know what that means for us. But I want to figure it out. Together. Samuel shook his head, his jaw clenched. I've lived my whole life thinking I was on my own. You don't just drop a bombshell like this and expect everything to be fine. I know, Thomas replied, his heart heavy with the weight of what he was asking. I know this is hard. I don't expect you to forgive me for not finding you sooner. But I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. Samuel's eyes softened slightly, but the tension in his body remained. This is too much. I need time to process this. Take all the time you need, Thomas said, his voice quiet but filled with sincerity. I'll be here. I'm not going anywhere. Samuel nodded, his expression unreadable. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the cafe, disappearing into the rain. Thomas stood there for a long time, staring at the door through which his brother had just left. The conversation hadn't gone how he'd hoped. Samuel was angry, confused, understandably so, but at least now he knew the truth. And though the path ahead would be difficult, Thomas knew he had to give his brother the space to come to terms with everything. For years, Thomas had felt like something was missing. Now he knew what it was, and for the first time in his life, he felt like he was beginning to understand who he truly was. The rain had stopped by the time Thomas returned home, but the storm inside him still raged. Samuel's reaction had been understandable. He was angry, disoriented. His entire life turned upside down in a matter of moments. But Thomas couldn't let it end like that. The weight of the past, the lies, the separation, it all demanded answers. He needed to understand what had really happened all those years ago. The letter from his father had opened the door to the truth, but there was still so much left unexplained. Thomas had been raised in privilege, with every advantage, while Samuel had been left to fend for himself. Why hadn't his father found him? Why had Samuel been lost to the system? These questions gnawed at him, and Thomas knew there was only one place left to turn. The hospital records from the day they were born. 2 days later, Thomas stood outside the brick facade of New York General Hospital, the place where his life and Samuel's had been so violently split apart. The smell of antiseptic and the quiet buzz of medical staff moving about their day was somehow comforting to him. But he wasn't here for comfort. He was here for answers. He had pulled some strings, using his wealth and influence to gain access to the archives. Now, he found himself seated in a sterile, white-walled records room, the air thick with the weight of history. Stacks of old documents lay before him, records of the fire, birth certificates, and hospital admissions from that fateful day. He combed through them, his heart pounding with anticipation, and then there it was. A tattered folder marked Harrison Twins. The faded ink on the cover sent a chill down his spine. He opened it carefully, his eyes scanning the pages. His own birth certificate, along with Samuel's, were inside, confirming what he already knew. They had been born minutes apart. But as he dug deeper into the file, something strange caught his attention. A document dated 2 days after their birth, a discharge form for Samuel. But the signature, it wasn't his mother's, nor his father's. The name signed at the bottom of the form was unfamiliar, Dr. Harold Meyer. Thomas frowned. Who was Dr. Meyer? He had never heard the name before. Why would someone else have signed for Samuel's discharge? He turned the page, his breath catching in his throat. There was a note attached to the discharge form. It was a brief, typed message, cold and clinical. Patient discharged into the care of a Mr. and Mrs. Carter due to presumed death of parents in hospital fire. Thomas stared at the note, his heart pounding in his chest. Presumed death of parents? But his parents hadn't died. They had survived the fire. Only Samuel had been taken, separated from them. But whoever had signed these papers had lied, had made it look like the Harrisons were dead, and in the chaos that followed, Samuel had been given to another family. The realization hit Thomas like a punch to the gut. Samuel hadn't just been lost. He had been taken. But why? The answers were buried deeper than he had expected, but now he had a new name to investigate, Dr. Harold Meyer. He knew it wouldn't be easy to track down a doctor from nearly 30 years ago, but if anyone had answers, it would be him. The next morning, Thomas made calls, pushing through layers of hospital bureaucracy. Days passed, each one more frustrating than the last. But eventually, he got a lead. Dr. Meyer had retired years ago, but he was still alive, living in a quiet neighborhood just outside the city. Without hesitation, Thomas arranged a meeting. When he arrived at the modest house, Thomas couldn't help but feel the tension building inside him. This was it, the man who had signed Samuel's life away, who had lied about his parents being dead, severing the bond between two brothers. Thomas didn't know what to expect, but he was prepared for anything. An elderly man answered the door, his eyes tired and sunken, his hair a thin wisp of gray. "Yes?" he asked, his voice frail but steady. "Dr. Meyer?" Thomas asked, trying to keep his voice calm. "I'm Thomas Harrison. I believe you were involved in my family's case many years ago. The Harrison twins?" At the mention of the twins, Dr. Meyer's face paled. His eyes darted around nervously, and for a moment, Thomas thought the man might close the door on him. But after a long pause, the doctor nodded. "I remember," he said quietly, stepping aside to let Thomas in. Inside, the house smelled of age, dust, and old wood. Dr. Meyer led Thomas to a small living room, motioning for him to sit. The doctor sank into a worn armchair, his hands trembling slightly. "I knew this day would come," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "but I hoped it never would." Thomas leaned forward, his patience frayed. "I need to know the truth," he said firmly. "Why did you separate us? Why was my brother taken from us?" Dr. Meyer looked down at his hands, shame flooding his features. "It wasn't supposed to happen," he murmured, "but there were pressures. After the fire, there was so much chaos. Babies were lost, families torn apart. But the Carters, they had been trying to adopt for years. They couldn't have children of their own. And when Samuel's paperwork got mixed up, they were desperate. I thought I was doing the right thing, giving them a child who needed a family. But I knew it was wrong. I knew." Thomas stared at him, his chest tight with rage. "You stole him," he said, his voice cold. "You lied to my family. You tore us apart." Dr. Meyer's hands shook harder now. "I didn't know your parents had survived," he said, his voice cracking. I thought they were dead, like so many others. By the time I realized the truth, it was too late. The Carters had bonded with Samuel. I didn't have the heart to take him away from them." Thomas's fists clenched, his mind reeling. His brother had been stolen from him, sold to another family because of one man's mistake. It was almost too much to process. "I don't care what you thought," Thomas said, his voice rising with anger. "You ruined both of our lives." Dr. Meyer's eyes filled with tears, his guilt palpable. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I've lived with this for years. I've always wondered what became of Samuel, but I never had the courage to face what I'd done." Thomas stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't bear to be in the same room with this man any longer. "I found Samuel," he said quietly, his voice filled with emotion, "but I don't know if he'll ever forgive me for what you did." Without another word, Thomas turned and left the house, the door closing behind him with a heavy thud. As he drove away, the weight of the truth pressed down on him. It was worse than he had imagined. His family's tragedy had been orchestrated by one man's fear, one man's decision to hide the truth. But now that the truth was out, Thomas knew there was only one thing left to do. confront Samuel again. This time, armed with the full story, he would fight to rebuild the bond that had been stolen from them both. The car engine hummed beneath Thomas as he drove through the narrow streets leading to Samuel's house. He could barely focus on the road, his mind swirling with the weight of what he had uncovered. The truth he had learned from Dr. Meyer was a burden heavier than he had anticipated. Samuel hadn't just been lost. He had been taken, stolen from a family who never stopped searching for him. Thomas knew what he had to do now, but the thought of telling Samuel made his chest tighten with dread. How do you explain a betrayal so profound? How do you ask for forgiveness when you had been the one living the privileged life, while your brother struggled in ignorance? It was late afternoon when Thomas pulled into Samuel's driveway, his heart pounding as he cut the engine. The house stood quiet and unassuming, but inside, Thomas knew, lay the unresolved tension of their last meeting. He had no idea how Samuel would react to what he had to say. The truth could either bring them together or destroy any chance they had at a relationship. For a moment, he hesitated, his hand resting on the car door handle. What if Samuel wanted nothing to do with him? What if this revelation only pushed him further away? But he knew he had come too far to turn back now. He had to try. Taking a deep breath, Thomas stepped out of the car and walked up to the front door. He knocked twice, his heart racing in the silence that followed. A few seconds later, the door opened and Samuel stood before him. His expression was guarded, the lines of frustration still etched into his features from their last encounter. "What do you want?" Samuel asked, his tone flat, but not hostile. Thomas could see the weariness in his eyes, a reflection of his own emotional exhaustion. "I found out what happened," Thomas said quietly, his voice heavy with the weight of the truth. "Why we were separated. Why you never knew." Samuel's eyes flickered with something unreadable. Curiosity, maybe, but mostly suspicion. He stepped aside, letting Thomas in without a word. Inside, the house was as modest as before, but the tension between them was thick, almost suffocating. They sat at the small kitchen table, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Thomas searched for the right words, but there was no easy way to explain what had been done to them. "I went to see Dr. Meyer," Thomas began, finally breaking the silence. "He's the doctor who signed your discharge papers after the fire at the hospital. He's the reason we were separated." Samuel leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "What are you talking about? How could a doctor decide to separate us?" Thomas took a deep breath. It wasn't supposed to happen. After the fire, things were chaotic. There were missing children, families, it was a mess. But Dr. Meyer, he made a choice. He thought our parents were dead, and instead of looking further, he gave you to the Carters. He thought he was doing the right thing by giving you to a family that couldn't have children of their own. Samuel's face darkened as the words sank in. "You're telling me I was given away? Like I was some kind of charity case?" His voice was low, dangerous, as though he were barely holding back a torrent of emotions. Thomas nodded, his heart aching as he saw the pain in Samuel's eyes. "It was a mistake, Samuel. A terrible mistake. But by the time Dr. Meyer realized what he had done, it was too late. The Carters had already raised you as their own, and he was too afraid to correct it." Samuel pushed back from the table, standing abruptly, pacing the small kitchen like a caged animal. "So, all this time, I was living a lie? You were out there living your life, with our real parents, while I was—" He stopped, his voice catching in his throat. "While I was left with nothing." Thomas stood too, wanting to reach out, to offer some kind of comfort, but he knew there was nothing he could say to make this right. "I didn't know, Samuel," he said quietly. "I didn't know until recently. If I had known sooner, I would have found you. I would have brought you home." Samuel turned to face him, his eyes blazing with anger and hurt. "Home? What home? The Carters are the only family I've ever known. My life, my whole life, was built on a lie. And you had everything. You had a family, wealth, opportunities, while I was struggling just to survive." "I know," Thomas said, his voice filled with regret. "I know, and I'm sorry. I can't change what happened. But we're not enemies, Samuel. We're brothers." Samuel stared at him, his jaw tight, the rage simmering beneath the surface. Brothers? Do you really believe that? Because all I see is a stranger standing in my kitchen, telling me that my entire existence was a mistake. Thomas swallowed hard, feeling the chasm between them widening. You're not a mistake, he said, his voice firm. What happened wasn't fair, and it wasn't right. But that doesn't change the fact that we're blood. We're family, and I want to make this right, if you'll let me. Samuel shook his head, laughing bitterly. Make this right? How, Thomas? How do you make up for decades of a life stolen from me? How do you erase all the years I spent wondering who I was while you lived in luxury? Thomas felt the sting of those words, but he didn't back down. I can't erase it. I can't change the past, but I want to try to be a part of your life now. I want us to build something, together. Samuel's fists clenched at his sides, the anger still radiating off of him, but behind it, Thomas could see something else, something raw and unguarded. Samuel was hurt, betrayed, and alone. And beneath all that anger, Thomas knew he wanted answers, the same way Thomas had wanted them. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick with unspoken words, the air heavy with everything they had lost. And then, slowly, Samuel's shoulders slumped. The fight seemed to drain out of him, leaving only exhaustion in its place. I don't know if I can forgive this, Samuel said quietly, his voice rough. I don't know if I can ever look at you and not feel like something was taken from me. Thomas nodded, his heart heavy. I understand, and if you need time, I'll give you that. But please, don't shut me out. Not completely. Samuel looked away, his jaw tight, the silence between them stretching on. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and weary. I need space, Thomas. I need to figure out what this all means. Thomas nodded, knowing he had to respect that. He had dropped a bombshell on Samuel's entire world, and it would take time, maybe a long time, to heal the wounds that had been ripped open. All right, Thomas said softly. I'll be here, whenever you're ready. Without another word, Samuel walked out of the kitchen, leaving Thomas standing alone in the silence. As Thomas drove home, he couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled deep in his gut. The truth had come out, but it hadn't brought them closer. It had only deepened the divide between them. And now, Thomas feared, there was no going back. The days after Thomas and Samuel's confrontation felt like an eternity. The weight of the truth lingered between them, heavy and unresolved. Thomas had hoped that exposing the secrets of their past would be a step toward healing, but it had only seemed to deepen the divide. Now, as he sat alone in his apartment, he wondered if his brother would ever want anything to do with him again. Thomas had given Samuel the space he had asked for, but he couldn't stop the gnawing anxiety in his gut. What if the space only pushed Samuel further away? What if the anger and betrayal Samuel felt were too deep to overcome? Thomas had spent the last few days replaying their conversation, questioning every word he had said. Maybe he had been too forceful. Maybe he hadn't given Samuel enough time to process it all. But there was no going back now. He had done everything he could to lay the truth bare. Now, it was up to Samuel to decide what came next. On the other side of the city, Samuel sat in his small workshop, the rhythmic sound of a saw cutting through wood barely masking the storm brewing inside him. He had thrown himself into work, trying to drown out the thoughts that wouldn't stop plaguing him. The truth Thomas had revealed gnawed at him, keeping him awake at night, his mind replaying every moment of the past week over and over again. He hated the idea that his entire life had been a lie, that the family who had raised him had done so under false pretenses. He had loved the Carters. They were good people. They had cared for him, taught him everything he knew. But they weren't his real family. His real family had been living a life of privilege while he struggled. The resentment gnawed at him, but so did the guilt. How could he hate people who had loved him? People who had given him everything they had, even if it wasn't the whole truth. And then there was Thomas. Samuel didn't know what to make of his so-called brother. On the one hand, he felt an undeniable connection to him, as if some invisible thread bound them together. But on the other hand, Thomas was everything Samuel had grown up resenting. Wealthy, privileged, part of a world Samuel had never known. How could they ever bridge that gap? As the hours ticked by, Samuel found himself staring at the same piece of wood, his hands still, his mind lost in thought. He knew he couldn't stay angry forever. It wasn't in his nature to hold grudges, but the idea of forging a relationship with Thomas felt impossible. They were from two different worlds. How could they ever come together? But deep down, Samuel knew there was more to it than that. The truth was, he wasn't just angry at Thomas. He was angry at himself. Angry that he had lived his whole life without knowing where he truly came from. Angry that he had never asked the questions that had always lingered at the back of his mind. And now that the truth was in front of him, he didn't know what to do with it. Several days passed before Samuel finally picked up the phone and dialed Thomas's number. His heart pounded as he waited for the call to connect, unsure of what he was even going to say. But before he could think too much about it, Thomas answered. "Samuel?" Thomas's voice was cautious, as if he wasn't sure whether to be hopeful or afraid. "Yeah, it's me," Samuel replied, his voice rough. There was a long pause before he finally spoke again. "I've been thinking about what you said." Thomas didn't interrupt. He knew better than to rush Samuel into anything. Instead, he let the silence linger, waiting for Samuel to continue. "I don't know what to do with all of this," Samuel admitted. "It's a lot to take in, and I'm not sure I'm ready to forgive anyone for what happened, especially not you." Thomas felt a lump rise in his throat, but forced himself to stay calm. "I understand. You don't have to forgive me, Samuel. Not now, maybe not ever. But I'm still here. I'm not going anywhere." Samuel's breath caught, a mixture of frustration and something else, reluctant understanding. "You don't get it," he said. "I've been alone my whole life, Thomas. I've never relied on anyone but myself. And now you show up, and everything I thought I knew is gone. I don't even know who I am anymore." "I can't pretend to know what you're feeling," Thomas said gently. "But you're not alone in this, Samuel. You never were. And whether you want it or not, you have a brother. I'm here, and I want to know you. Really know you. Not out of guilt, but because we've lost so much time already. I don't want to lose any more." Samuel didn't respond right away. He wasn't used to people offering support without expecting something in return. But Thomas's words cut through the armor he had spent years building around himself. "Maybe," Samuel said, his voice barely audible, "maybe we could try. I don't know if I'll ever trust you. I don't know if we'll ever be brothers. But I guess we could start somewhere." It wasn't much, but it was more than Thomas had hoped for. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "We can start wherever you want, Samuel. I'm not expecting anything. I just want us to move forward, whatever that looks like." Samuel was quiet again. But this time the silence felt different, less tense, more reflective. "There's something else I've been thinking about," he said slowly. "If what you said about Dr. Meyer is true, and I was taken from you, then there's more to this story. I don't think we've uncovered everything yet." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean?" "I mean, if this was all a mistake, then why did it happen? Who let it happen? And why didn't anyone say anything sooner? Something doesn't add up." Thomas had wondered the same thing. "I've been thinking the same thing," he admitted. "I'm starting to believe there's more to our separation than just a hospital mix-up. Maybe it's time we look deeper into our family's past, find out what really happened the day we were born." Samuel's eyes darkened with resolve. "I'm not ready to call you my brother yet, Thomas. But if you're right, if there's more to this than we know, then I want to find out the truth. For both of us." A sense of determination settled between them, a fragile but growing bond forming as they realized they shared the same goal. There was something in their past, something hidden that had shaped both of their lives, and now they were both ready to face it. "Then we'll find out together," Thomas said, his voice steady. "Whatever it takes." Samuel nodded, though Thomas couldn't see it. "I'll call you when I'm ready." And with that, the call ended. Thomas set the phone down, feeling a cautious sense of hope rising in his chest. It wasn't reconciliation, not yet, but it was something. And after everything they had been through, it was more than he could have asked for. They were going to fight for the truth, together. Whatever came next, they would face it as brothers, even if Samuel wasn't ready to say it out loud yet. The morning sun filtered through the large windows of Thomas's office, casting long shadows across the room. He sat at his desk, his eyes scanning old family documents laid out in front of him. Letters, birth certificates, and fragments of news clippings were scattered around, the puzzle of their past slowly taking shape. But something still didn't fit. He could feel it, a piece of the story that remained just out of reach, hidden beneath layers of forgotten history. Samuel had agreed to meet him that morning. After days of tense silence, the phone call had come out of the blue. "I'm ready to talk," Samuel had said. And now, as Thomas waited, a mixture of anticipation and unease settled in his chest. The knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He stood as Samuel walked in, his expression unreadable but calmer than before. The bitterness in his eyes had softened, though the weight of their last conversation still lingered between them. "Hey," Samuel said, his voice low but steady. "Hey," Thomas replied. There was a moment of awkward silence, but Thomas gestured toward the papers. "I've been digging into our family history, trying to find anything that might explain what really happened back then." Samuel stepped closer, glancing down at the documents with mild curiosity. "And? What have you found?" Thomas sighed. "Not much. Birth records, family wills, some personal letters between our parents. But there's nothing about the fire. Nothing about why you were taken or how Dr. Meyer got involved." Samuel's brow furrowed as he scanned the papers. "So, we're back to square one?" "Not quite," Thomas said, a spark of determination flickering in his voice. "There's still one place we haven't looked." Samuel raised an eyebrow. "Where?" "The estate," Thomas said quietly. "Our family's old estate. It's been locked up for years, but if there are answers anywhere, it's there." Samuel looked at him skeptically. "You think there's some hidden vault of secrets just waiting for us to find?" "I don't know," Thomas admitted, "but I have a feeling that if we want the truth, we have to go back to where it all started." Later that afternoon, the two brothers stood outside the old Harrison estate. It was a sprawling mansion on the outskirts of the city, its grandeur now dulled by years of neglect. The tall iron gates creaked open as they walked up the path, the house looming ahead like a relic of another time. It was the place where Thomas had grown up, where he had lived a life of privilege, while Samuel had been lost to the world. Thomas unlocked the front door, the heavy oak groaning as it swung open. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of old wood. The grand foyer stretched out before them, with its towering ceilings and dark, polished floors. The walls were lined with portraits of generations of Harrisons, each one staring down with cold, imperious eyes. "This place is massive," Samuel muttered as they stepped inside, his eyes scanning the ornate details of the home. "I've never been anywhere like this." Thomas felt a pang of guilt. This had been his home, a symbol of the life he had lived while Samuel struggled in foster care, moving from one small, cramped home to the next. "I didn't appreciate it when I lived here," Thomas admitted. "It always felt like a museum more than a home." They moved through the house, each room more opulent than the last. Samuel seemed out of place in the grandeur of it all, his rugged demeanor clashing with the elegance of the mansion. But there was something else, something haunting about the silence that filled the space. It felt like a place frozen in time, untouched since their parents had lived there. "Where are we supposed to look?" Samuel asked, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "There's an old office on the second floor," Thomas said. "It belonged to our father. He kept most of the family's records there. If there's anything about what happened to us, it would be there." They made their way upstairs, the wooden steps creaking under their weight. The hallway was lined with more portraits, each one more imposing than the last. At the end of the corridor, they found the office. The door was slightly ajar, as if waiting for them. Inside, the room was exactly as Thomas remembered it. Dark wood paneling, a large mahogany desk, and shelves filled with books and documents. It was the heart of the Harrison family legacy, but it also felt like the place where secrets had been buried. Samuel moved toward the desk, his hand brushing over the surface as if trying to feel some connection to the man who had sat there, the father he had never known. "What exactly are we looking for?" he asked. Thomas joined him at the desk, pulling open one of the drawers. "Anything that might explain why you were taken. There has to be something. Papers, letters, Anything? For the next hour, they sifted through old documents, financial records, legal papers, family correspondence, but nothing pointed to the fire or Samuel's disappearance. It was as if the event had been erased from their family's history. Frustration gnawed at them both as they dug deeper into the drawers, searching for something, anything, that would shed light on what had happened. But just when Thomas was about to give up, he noticed something strange. There was a small keyhole in the back of the desk, barely visible beneath the layers of dust. Thomas reached for it, his heart racing. "There's something here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Samuel looked over, his eyes narrowing. "A hidden compartment?" Thomas nodded, pulling the key from his pocket that had been passed down to him with the estate. His hands trembled slightly as he inserted it into the lock. With a soft click, the compartment opened, revealing a stack of old letters tied together with a thin ribbon. He pulled them out carefully, the paper brittle with age. As they unfolded the first letter, Thomas's breath caught in his throat. "Dearest Harold," the letter began. "As agreed, the boy will be placed in the care of the Carters. The details have been arranged. Our family's reputation cannot survive the scandal that would ensue if the truth were revealed. This must remain between us. The Harrisons must endure, no matter the cost." The signature at the bottom was unmistakable. It was their mother's. Samuel stared at the letter, his face pale, his fists clenching at his sides. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice tight with anger. Thomas's heart sank. He couldn't believe what he was reading. "It was planned," he whispered, his voice hollow. "The separation, it wasn't an accident. Our parents, our mother, arranged it." Samuel's eyes blazed with fury. "They didn't lose me in the fire. They gave me away." The revelation hit them both like a tidal wave. Everything they thought they knew, the fire, the disappearance, the years of searching, had been a lie. Their mother had orchestrated it all, for reasons they couldn't yet understand. "I don't believe this," Samuel said, his voice shaking. "After everything, she did this to us?" Thomas's mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. Why would their mother, a woman who had raised him with love, do something so cruel? "There must be more to this," he said. "We need to find out why." Samuel's face hardened, the pain in his eyes giving way to anger. "I don't care why," he spat. "She destroyed my life. I spent years wondering who I was, and now I find out it was all because of her." Thomas reached out, but Samuel pulled away. "Don't," Samuel said, his voice cold. "I'm done with this. I'm done with all of it." He stormed out of the room, leaving Thomas standing there, the letter trembling in his hand. Samuel's footsteps echoed in the grand hallway as he stormed out of the office, his anger radiating through every step. The revelation that their mother had orchestrated his separation from the family was too much to process. Betrayal, rage, and grief warred within him, each emotion sharper than the last. Thomas called after him, but Samuel didn't stop. He couldn't stay there any longer, couldn't stand in the house that had been the center of the life he was denied. Outside, the cold air hit his face like a slap, but it did nothing to cool the fury burning inside him. His entire life had been a lie. The family he had imagined, the one he thought he'd lost in the fire, had given him away, willingly. How was he supposed to reconcile that? How could he ever forgive them for something so cruel? Thomas caught up to him just as Samuel reached the edge of the driveway. "Samuel, wait." His voice was pleading, but Samuel didn't want to hear it. "Why?" Samuel snapped, rounding on him. "Why should I listen to anything you have to say? You knew about this, didn't you?" "I didn't." Thomas's voice was filled with desperation. "I swear, I had no idea. I found out when you did. I'm as shocked as you are." Samuel's chest heaved, the betrayal cutting deep. "You lived in that house. You had her love, her care. Meanwhile, I grew up without knowing anything about who I really was. And now this?" Thomas flinched at the harsh truth in Samuel's words, but he forced himself to meet his brother's gaze. "You're right. I had everything, and you had nothing. But I didn't know what was taken from you, Samuel. I didn't know how deep this went. Our mother, she hid it from me too. We both lost something, and it's not fair." Samuel shook his head, the pain in his eyes raw and unfiltered. It's worse than that. You can't just fix this, Thomas. It's not something that can be made better. Thomas swallowed hard, unsure of how to make Samuel understand that they had both been victims of the same lie. I'm not asking you to forgive her. Not now, maybe not ever. But don't walk away from this, from us. We've come this far, Samuel. We've uncovered the truth, but we still don't know why. We need to confront her. Together. Samuel's jaw clenched as he processed what Thomas was saying. Confronting their mother, the woman who had shattered his life, felt impossible. But beneath his anger, there was something else, the need for answers. If there was a reason, if there was any justification for what she had done, Samuel needed to hear it from her. After a long, agonizing silence, he finally spoke. "Fine," he said, his voice hard. "We'll confront her. But don't expect me to make peace with this. I just want the truth." Thomas nodded, relief washing over him. "We'll do it together." The following evening, they stood outside their mother's house. It was smaller and more modest than the grand estate, but it was still filled with the air of old wealth, the kind of place that reeked of family legacies and secrets kept buried for too long. Thomas glanced at Samuel, who stood rigidly by his side, his hands balled into fists. This confrontation was about more than just finding answers. It was about Samuel reclaiming a part of his life that had been stolen from him. Thomas knew that no matter what happened next, their relationship would never be the same. It couldn't be. He knocked on the door, and after a moment, Eleanor Harrison answered. She was elegant as always, her silver hair pulled back into a neat bun, her posture straight and dignified. But when her eyes fell on Samuel standing beside Thomas, her expression faltered. "Thomas?" she asked, her voice uncertain, eyes flickering between the two men. "What's going on?" Thomas stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "We need to talk, Mom." Eleanor's eyes widened slightly, sensing the gravity of the situation. She stepped aside, allowing them in without another word. The tension in the air was thick as they moved into the sitting room, the silence between them heavy with anticipation. Eleanor sat down slowly, her eyes still on Samuel, as if seeing a ghost she thought was long buried. "I'm not sure what this is about," she began carefully, though her voice betrayed her unease. "But I assume it has something to do with Samuel." Samuel's eyes narrowed, his fists clenched at his sides. "You knew," he said, his voice cold. "You knew the whole time." Eleanor looked at him, her face pale. "I don't know what you're—" "Don't lie to us," Samuel snapped, his voice rising with fury. "We found the letter, Mom. We know what you did. You arranged for me to be taken away. You let them give me to the Carters." The words hung in the air like a bomb. Eleanor's face fell, her carefully composed expression crumbling as she looked away, her hands trembling slightly. "I didn't want this," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't want to give you away." Samuel's laugh was bitter, filled with years of pain. "But you did, didn't you? You chose to give me away and keep Thomas. Why?" Tears welled up in Eleanor's eyes, but she held them back, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "It wasn't supposed to happen this way," she said, her voice shaking. "After the fire, we were told you had died. And for a time, we believed it. But then, when we found out you were alive, it was too late." "Too late for what?" Samuel demanded. "To bring me home? To fix the mistake?" Eleanor looked at him, her eyes filled with sorrow. "Our family's reputation was at stake. There were complications, things you don't understand. The Carters had already bonded with you, and we couldn't just take you back. It would have caused a scandal." "A scandal?" Samuel's voice was filled with disbelief. "You sacrificed me for a scandal? For your precious reputation?" Eleanor flinched at his words, her eyes filling with guilt. "I know it was wrong. I've lived with the regret every day. But you have to understand, I thought I was doing what was best for everyone. We couldn't risk the truth coming out. It would have destroyed the family." "Destroyed the family?" Samuel repeated, incredulous. "You destroyed me." Thomas stepped forward, his voice tight with anger. "Why didn't you tell me, Mom?" Why did you let me grow up believing Samuel had died in that fire?" Eleanor looked up at him, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "I wanted to protect you. You were the heir to the Harrison name, the one who would carry on the family legacy. I thought, if you knew the truth, it would break you. I didn't want to burden you with the weight of what we had done." Samuel shook his head, his heart pounding with anger and grief. "This wasn't about protecting me or Thomas. It was about protecting yourself. You sacrificed me for the Harrison name." Eleanor sobbed, her hands covering her face. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I was wrong. I was wrong, and I've regretted it every day. But I can't take it back." For a long moment, the room was silent, the weight of Eleanor's confession hanging heavy in the air. Samuel stood rigid, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he fought to control the storm of emotions inside him. Thomas looked at his brother, his heart aching with guilt and helplessness. There was nothing he could say to make this right, nothing that could undo the damage that had been done. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you," Samuel said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I needed to hear the truth." Eleanor nodded, tears still streaming down her face. "I understand," she whispered. "I don't expect your forgiveness. I only wish I could go back and change what I did. But there was no going back. The damage was done, and now they all had to live with the consequences." Samuel turned toward the door, his face unreadable, his body tense with unresolved pain. "I'm done here," he said, his voice cold. "I don't want anything to do with this family anymore." "Samuel, wait," Thomas pleaded, stepping toward him. But Samuel didn't stop. He walked out of the house without looking back, leaving Thomas and Eleanor in the silence of the broken past. Thomas sat in the quiet stillness of his apartment, his mind a battlefield of emotions. Days had passed since Samuel stormed out of their mother's house, leaving behind a trail of shattered truths and broken promises. Thomas had replayed the events of that evening over and over, the weight of their mother's betrayal still heavy on his chest. He had hoped that the truth would bring them closer together, that the shared pain of the past would help them rebuild. But instead, it seemed to have driven Samuel further away. The silence that followed Samuel's departure was suffocating. Thomas had called, left messages, each one more desperate than the last. But Samuel hadn't responded. It felt like the walls were closing in, the weight of everything they had uncovered pressing down on him. He had fought so hard to bring them together, but now it seemed like the very truth they had sought was tearing them apart. He glanced at his phone again, hoping for a missed call, a text, anything. But the screen remained dark, the silence deafening. Across town, Samuel sat alone in his workshop, the steady hum of machinery in the background doing little to quiet the storm inside him. The confrontation with his mother had left him reeling, his emotions a tangled mess of anger, betrayal, and grief. He had thought that finding the truth would bring him some kind of peace, but all it had done was open wounds he didn't know how to heal. The Carters, the family who had raised him, had loved him, of that he had no doubt. But now, with the truth of his origins laid bare, he couldn't help but feel like his entire life had been a lie. His mother had chosen to keep him in the dark, to protect the family's name over his own well-being. And Thomas, what was he supposed to do about Thomas? They were brothers, but they had lived such different lives. How could they ever bridge that gap? Samuel's hands tightened around the edge of his workbench, his knuckles turning white. He didn't know what he wanted anymore. Part of him wanted to walk away from it all, to leave the Harrison name behind and never look back. But another part of him, the part that had longed for answers, for family, wasn't ready to give up just yet. The sound of his phone buzzing broke through the silence. Samuel glanced at the screen, expecting another call from Thomas. But instead, it was a message, a picture, actually. Emma, his daughter, was smiling up at him from the screen, her face lit with joy as she held up a small drawing she had made. "Look what I made for you, Daddy," the message read, accompanied by a voice memo of her giggling, as innocent as ever. Samuel stared at the picture for a long time, a slow ache building in his chest. Emma, she was the one good thing in his life, the one constant. She didn't know anything about the mess he was caught in. She didn't care about family legacies or old betrayals. All she cared about was whether her daddy would be home to tuck her in at night, to tell her stories and make her laugh. And then it hit him. Emma was his future. No matter what had happened in the past, no matter how angry or broken he felt, he couldn't let this destroy his future. His daughter needed him to be present, to be whole. And if there was even a chance that Thomas could be a part of that future, a part of their lives, then maybe, just maybe, it was worth trying one last time. With a deep breath, Samuel stood up, grabbed his jacket, and headed for the door. Thomas was sitting in his living room, staring blankly at the TV when the knock came. It was tentative, hesitant, almost as if the person on the other side wasn't sure if they should be there. Thomas frowned, his heart racing as he stood up and crossed the room. When he opened the door, Samuel stood there, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his face a mix of uncertainty and exhaustion. "I thought you might have been avoiding me," Thomas said, his voice low, trying to mask the hope he felt rising in his chest. Samuel shrugged, his eyes downcast. "I needed time," he admitted, "to think, to figure out where I stand with all of this." Thomas stepped aside, gesturing for Samuel to come in. The tension between them was palpable, but there was something different in Samuel's demeanor now, something softer, less guarded. They sat down across from each other, the silence heavy but not unbearable. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Thomas wasn't sure where to begin, and Samuel seemed just as unsure. Finally, Samuel broke the silence. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive her," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "What she did, it's not something I can just get over." Thomas nodded, understanding the pain in his brother's words. "I don't expect you to," he said gently. "I'm still trying to wrap my head around it myself. She made a choice, and it was the wrong one." Samuel looked up, his eyes searching Thomas's face for some kind of reassurance. "I've spent my whole life wondering who I was, trying to figure out where I fit in. And now, I finally have answers, but I don't know if I want them." Thomas leaned forward, his voice soft but filled with sincerity. "You don't have to decide right now, Samuel. We've been through a lot, and it's going to take time. But I don't want to lose you. Not after everything we've uncovered. We're brothers. We may not have grown up together, but that doesn't mean we can't build something now." Samuel was quiet for a long time, his eyes drifting toward the window. "Emma," he said finally, "she deserves to know her family. If not for me, then for her. I don't want her growing up with the same questions I had." Thomas's heart swelled with relief. "I'd like that," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'd like to get to know her, and I'd like her to get to know me too." For the first time in what felt like ages, a small smile tugged at the corner of Samuel's mouth. "She's the best part of my life," he said softly. "She keeps me grounded." There was a long pause as the two men sat in the shared quiet of the room. The weight of their past still lingered, but for the first time, the future didn't feel so uncertain. They had both been through hell, but now, maybe, they had a chance to build something together. Samuel took a deep breath, his shoulders finally relaxing. "I'm not ready to forgive everything that's happened," he admitted, "but I'm not going to walk away from this. From you. Maybe we can figure it out as we go." Thomas smiled, his chest lightening with hope. "That's all I want, Samuel. To figure it out. Together." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable this time. It was filled with the quiet promise of something new. For the first time, the past didn't feel like an anchor dragging them down. It felt like a bridge, connecting them, even through the pain and betrayal. "Come by this weekend," Samuel said, standing up. "Emma would love to meet you. She doesn't know it yet, but she's getting an uncle." Thomas grinned, his heart full. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." As Samuel left, Thomas stood at the window, watching his brother disappear into the night. The future wasn't going to be easy, and the wounds of the past would take time to heal. But for the first time in a long time, Thomas felt hope. They had found each other, and despite everything, they had a chance to move forward, not as strangers, but as brothers.